Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds, a poetry and verse-loving edition, young adult literature edition of the show, and delighted on this episode to be talking with author and poet, although I don't think those are two separate things actually, Robin Gow. Robin, thank you for jumping in and joining me.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. I appreciate your work in verse, and I believe you have a new book that's on the way in May. Is that one also in verse? Or are you exploring the worlds of prose? Just curious. I couldn't tell from the description on Amazon.
Yeah, it's actually the first book that I think, for at least for a younger readership, that is in prose. So yeah, it's going to be in prose.
Oh, great, great. Well, you're welcome to share anything about that as we go through. But my first question for you, and we'll get around to talking about some of the books as well, is what connected you with poetry and the written word?
Really interesting question. I think the first thing I would say is that I've always been like a storyteller. And I think that that comes from like my family has always told like tall tales and stuff like that. Like my dad used to tell me stories before bed. And I always say storyteller because I didn't really write until I didn't really write well. I have had like different kinds of like learning disabilities. And so like as a young kid, I like mostly told stories through pictures and through like stuffed animals and stuff like that. But as I got older, I like had this idea in my head that I wanted to be like a great novelist or something going into college. And in my first writing class, we had to pick a specialty. So it was like an intro creative writing. So everyone had to pick something. It was either nonfiction, poetry, or fiction, and everyone wanted to do fiction. And my professor was like, you actually like applied to the school on some poems, and like I think that you're good at poetry, so you should specialize in poetry. And I was grumpy about it at the time, but the assignment ended up it felt very like affirming, and it felt very like a space that I wanted to continue to grow in. And I think that moving on from there, like I've always still dabbled in all the different kinds of genres. I'm kind of like I consider myself kind of like a genre blurring author.
Hmm.
But I do think that poetry has always kind of been my like home base, so to say, and I've loved it. I think that for me, as somebody who has learning disabilities, is autistic, um, and sometimes I have a complicated relationship with words. I find poetry to be very forgiving of like mistakes and missteps with words, in that sometimes it can be generative to see how, if you misspeak, what can you do with those words? What does it mean? And I think that that like intense inspection on our language that poetry provides has always like made me feel drawn to it.
Yeah, and I love that approach to language and being an English teacher, editor kind of person. I wish that there was more of that play across forms with words and more sort of focus on the author and what they have to say. So I love that. I love that. And it sounds like a big connection happened in your college years, which is amazing as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing I would add about that is that a lot of that growth in poetry too came from being in spaces where people read poetry together. And I think that that's another thing that makes it really unique, is that people often read together. And I think some of my best lessons even weren't in classrooms. A lot of times it was from being able to get that feedback from a room of peers.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Now, I'm going to mention two of your works here, and you're welcome to mention others as well, of course. But A Million Quiet Revolutions being one of the novels in verse that's out in the world, and Dear Mothman as well.
Yeah.
And both of those are young adult or all ages sort of books. I say all ages because I don't think you can age out of your books necessarily. I think that anyone can enjoy them in that regard. So I'm curious about some of the challenges that you found and some of the growth you've kind of processed as someone who works for that particular audience.
Interesting because I think my initial impulse was to write about like myself when I was a young person, and I think that that feels kind of genreless to me. I think that like anyone can enjoy stories about youth and being a young person. I think some of the challenges come actually when I start to have conversations with editors and like with even my agent to talk about the stories because sometimes I've had to slightly reshape them to make them be able to get into schools and stuff.
Mm,
That was a lot
mhm,
of conversations too around A Million Quiet Revolutions because there are like some scenes that have like sexuality in them and intimacy. And I think that it was a difficult conversation because I feel like it's important for young people to have language to talk about those subjects.
mhm,
But at the same time, sometimes um, gatekeepers in those different spaces have I mean, right now we're in a time of like intense scrutiny onto books and due to
mhm.
like book banning and stuff. And so I think that sometimes that those conversations can be difficult because I'm somebody who's like a writer first. Like, I don't think about the publishing, like, from the like selling side of things. I think of like how a reader will react and respond to books. So I think that that can be difficult because at times I've had to kind of pull back on drawing on my own experiences for the sake of a book being um, able to be received by more people. I do think though that something that I think that the youth writing sphere is very, very open and very like welcoming. In that like youth are so interesting and so like curious about whatever you have to give. And I think that they're often a little bit less judgmental because they might not have had, I don't know, as many years to be reading things. And so I think that they're also more open to experimentation, which I think has been really valuable.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so with that idea of poetry in mind, you might have already connected to this answer, but what does poetry allow you to do in the stories that you want to tell?
I think that it allows for a lot of that like fluidity of emotions that we experience, especially a lot as youth. And I talk about this a lot when I'm talking about my like young adult books. Like when I think about my experience as being a teenager, like a lot of it was like roller coaster emotions, really extremes, really beautiful extremes, but sometimes like a intense emotional movement. And I think
Mhm,
poetry is a really great vehicle for illustrating that. I also think that I think that it allows the stories to sometimes move quickly through these emotions and through the moments, which can be, grab someone's attention in a way. So there's kind of the pacing element and then also that like emotional weight element.
yeah, yeah. I'm also going to shout out the use of the cryptid with Dear
Yeah.
Mothman. I love that. I love how you use illustrations in that, and starting it with like this class assignment. It's a very clever book in a lot of ways, and also very emotional as well.
Yeah.
So as readers are engaging with your writing, what do you hope they take away with them from the books?
I think that I always want my books to move in a direction towards calling the reader to explore the subjects of the book for themselves as well. For A Million Quiet Revolutions, it's really about exploring what it means to like see yourself in history and how we
Mhm,
relate to historical figures. And I think that what the book ultimately calls folks to do is to do that kind of exploration themselves.
mhm,
And then also to understand some of the nuances of queer and trans joy and grief. I think another key theme to my work is like holding simultaneous emotions. Like you can
mhm,
experience great joys alongside great sadness. And I think that that connects really deeply to Mo Dear Mothman too, because it's essentially a book about loss, about the main character losing his best friend, but it's also about him making new friends, and what it means to build new relationships while also processing that grief. Because we so often we don't usually have like a moment where it's just one thing. And I think that that can often be confusing for people at any age, but especially
mhm,
youth.
mhm.
And so holding space for those like emotionally knotted areas, I think is another like key thing in my work.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, that juxtaposition of emotion is so necessary. And, as somebody that's always bringing books into the classroom, I'm always thinking about how they're presented. And is it just grief? Is it just trauma? Or is it joy? And it's really a mixture of emotions. So I love that. And great that you capture that as an author.
you. I really try to. And I think that especially in a world of like a lot of young readers are like in a world with a lot of technology, I don't like necessarily think that like social media is bad, but I do
Hmm.
think that the short form has a way of collapsing nuance. And I see books as a space to kind of broaden that a little bit. Because there's usually so much nuance and layers to like any conversation. And so
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
like to show characters that grapple with those questions, kind of to balance out some of that sphere that might not be. And that can be helpful for any reader of any age too. But I specifically think about it when I'm thinking about writing for youth.
Yeah, yeah. But I love how verse novels allow that conversation to be seen, and there's that close attention to characters too. That's just something I love about the form, and you do that really well in the work as well.
You, I appreciate that so much. I really want to get more young folks into verse novels. I think it's so interesting. Often people will tell me like I'm scared of poetry. I don't know if I could read this. And I'm like, trust me, it's not that scary. Um, and I think that sometimes telling a story through poems can help make poetry less scary. I don't know why people are so scared of poetry. But I mean, I have my own theories. I think it's because people are scared of uncertainty in general.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
I just anything like that, they like want a story has a story, even if you have to interpret it. But a poem, it's like if you can't see the clear like thesis of the poem or something, it makes people uncomfortable. Um,
Right.
but not everybody, but a lot of people.
True. 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 So I have one more official question that's sort of a two-parter, maybe a three-parter. It depends on how you want to go about it. I always like to ask about work that's ahead, and I know that we have Gooseberry that is on the way in
Yes.
May, and so I'd love to hear a little bit about that, as well as any spaces where readers can connect with your work.
Totally. So I'm super excited about Gooseberry. Essentially, growing up, I loved stories about kids and their dogs, but I really wanted a book that was about like a queer kid and their dog. This book is about B, who doesn't really know what name they want to use, but they just go by their first initial. And they are obsessed with becoming a dog trainer. They're also a kid who's in foster care. And so they kind of have bounced around a lot and at like a block party they go to like a booth that has like a shelter and they meet this dog named Gooseberry who is incredibly not well behaved but they love Gooseberry and so they end up being able to get Gooseberry through a series of events when they move into a new foster home with that is a foster home with two queer parents. And so the story kind of follows a lot to do with their process of healing and also their process of like making peace with the fact that their dog might not be able to be like a perfectly trained dog like they want them to be. Um, I drew a lot on my own experiences for this because I had a phase of being a kid where I really wanted to be a dog trainer. I like memorized all the facts about dogs and stuff like that. And I wanted to like show dogs and I still love dogs. I have four, but like I not in the professional future for me, but
Yeah.
I gotta use some of that knowledge in writing this book. And I'm excited that it's in prose too. I think sometimes that can be accessible for folks. And it was just a story that seemed to lend itself to prose because there's a few more layers of characters. I'm excited about the main character's friend group too. I think that they're also really sweet characters. So, had a really great process with Abrams. They've been really kind and wonderful to my books, and they make really beautiful books. I was blown away by the cover art and stuff like that. So, and I'll probably bring my dogs to some events. So if anyone is local, like come out. You might see dogs too.
Love it, love
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Do you have a pet introduction that you'd like to make? What's your like favorite kind of go-to breed, or are you a person that mix and matches and has a pack of many kinds?
I have a pack of many kinds. They are away from my room because they are very loud. But I guess if I were to say a breed, I have two pugs, and I love pug dogs. I think that they're so silly and strange. But they definitely are have kind of my heart. But I love all my dogs the same. I have a Chihuahua and then also like a mixed breed that we don't really know what they are.
Yeah, yeah. Great, great. Dog lover here as well.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
yeah. So that last question, and then we can hit anything that we might have missed, and that is spaces where people can connect with you.
Oh yeah, I am on most social media, specifically Instagram and TikTok the most. I find it really interesting because I struggled with social media for a long time, and then I like got more into TikTok, and I think because it's a weird creative format, it's definitely sparked my interest. So if you want to see me do weird things, like my TikTok is Robin Gow Poet. I'm at Robin Gow Poet at all the different social medias, but that's the one that I'm having the most fun with.
Nice, nice. Well, I know you mentioned that compressed form, and most of my episodes tend to be pretty brief. Did we miss anything that you want to make sure to share for listeners?
Um, I guess the other thing that I would add is that I also write poetry for adults.
Hmm.
It always
Hmm.
feels weird it feels weird to say that because I'm like, I mean, like a young person could read it too, but I find like my adult poetry audience is more adults. Though I've had teenagers write to me about it. And I recently had a book come out called Lanternfly August.
Hmm.
So if you like more strict poetry collections, I also have some stuff for you.
Fantastic. Well, Robin, thank you for the time and the conversation, and thank you for the work and for expanding poetry, and glad to have you back anytime.
Oh, thank you so much. This was really beautiful, and I'm really grateful for your questions and for getting to spend some time with you.
Well, thank you so much.